We should have listened to Taylor when she said the house gave her a bad feeling. But we laughed it off, called her paranoid, dramatic. I remember standing there in the driveway, the rental keys in hand, looking up at the old house like it was some sort of prize. It had been my idea to rent it. A secluded, rustic getaway for a week, away from everything. Cheap, quiet, and surrounded by nothing but miles of forest. Perfect for a group of 5 teenagers eager to escape the suffocating routines of home. The house itself was old, but not exactly falling apart. 2 stories, faded white paint, and a wide porch that creaked underfoot. There were a few busted windows patched with plywood, but it had charm, the kind that comes with creaky floorboards and strange smells. It sat at the end of a gravel road that twisted through dense trees for what felt like forever. "Seriously, though," Taylor had said, crossing her arms, "this place is creepy. Why is it so cheap? Did anyone actually look into it?" "Chill out," said Adam, already unloading the trunk. "It's just old. Not haunted or anything. Besides, it's a rental. Probably a bunch of bad reviews about spiders or something." Or, Sarah chimed in, grinning, "Someone was murdered here, and now they're gonna murder us. Isn't that right, Jake?" She nudged her boyfriend, who just rolled his eyes. "Let's just get inside," I said, trying to brush off the tension. "It's been a long drive, and I need a shower." We unpacked quickly, claiming rooms on the 2nd floor. I ended up in the smallest one, a corner space with a window overlooking the overgrown backyard. It was quieter than I expected out there. No cars, no distant hum of highways. Just the occasional chirp of crickets and the rustle of wind through trees. Peaceful, but not in a comforting way. It felt like the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every creak and groan. By the time we got settled, the sun was already setting. Adam started a fire in the small stone pit out back, and we spent the first night laughing, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Mostly trying to spook Taylor. But she wasn't having it. She barely touched her drink and kept glancing at the tree line like she was expecting something to come out of it. "I'm just saying," she muttered at one point. "It's too quiet here. Where are the birds? I haven't seen a single one." The rest of us shrugged it off, too distracted by the novelty of being on our own, with no parents, no curfews, and no one to answer to. Felt like freedom. But that first night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. Something faint, just outside my window. I thought it might be the wind, but it didn't have that soft, irregular rhythm. It was steadier, a light tapping. I told myself it was a tree branch and pulled the blankets over my head, willing myself back to sleep. By morning, I'd convinced myself I'd imagined it. The second day started normal enough. We slept in, lounged around, and made plans to hike the trails we'd spotted on the way in. Taylor seemed to have shaken off her unease, or at least she was pretending to. By the time we set out, she was laughing along with everyone else, though I noticed she kept glancing over her shoulder, like she couldn't quite let go of the feeling that something was off. The trail was overgrown in parts, with tree roots twisting across the dirt and wildflowers brushing our ankles. Adam led the way, holding a stick like a sword and pretending to slash at invisible monsters. Jake and Sarah walked hand in hand, occasionally disappearing ahead of us, giggling like love-struck idiots. I stayed near Taylor, trying to match her pace, but the deeper we went, the quieter she got. "Hey," I said at one point, trying to sound casual. "You okay?" She hesitated before answering, her voice low. "Doesn't this feel weird to you?" "What, the woods?" "Not just the woods. Everything. The house, this trail, the air. It's like it's all watching us." She glanced around, her brow furrowed. "Doesn't it feel heavier out here?" I opened my mouth to brush it off, to tell her she was overthinking things. But then I stopped. She wasn't wrong. The air did feel heavier, like the kind of humidity that presses on your chest before a storm, except the sky above us was clear. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested. Before she could answer, Adam called out from up ahead. "Hey, check this out." We jogged to catch up. He was standing in a small clearing, gesturing toward a massive oak tree. Its bark was scarred with dozens of deep grooves, almost like claw marks, crisscrossing up the trunk. Jake and Sarah were staring too, their earlier playfulness replaced with quiet unease. "What the hell made those?" Jake asked, running a hand over the rough surface. "Bear, maybe?" Adam guessed. "Or a cougar?" Taylor shook her head. "No. Look at how high up they go. A bear wouldn't climb like that." The longer I looked, the more the marks unsettled me. They weren't jagged or random like you'd expect from an animal. They were deliberate, almost symmetrical, as if someone or something had carved them there on purpose. "Let's go back," Taylor said firmly, already turning to leave. Adam groaned. "You're such a buzzkill. It's probably just..." "Now," she snapped, her voice shaking. None of us argued. The walk back felt longer than it should have, like the trail was stretching out beneath our feet. By the time we got to the house, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the porch. Taylor stormed inside without a word, slamming the door behind her. That night, the tapping came again. But this time, it wasn't just at my window. I could hear it at Sarah and Jake's room, at Taylor's, even faintly from the direction of the front door. And when I finally worked up the courage to peek outside, there wasn't a tree branch in sight. By morning, the tapping was easy to write off as nerves or a trick of the wind, though none of us mentioned it. Breakfast was quiet. Jake's usual jokes fell flat. Adam kept checking his phone despite having no service, and Sarah picked at her food without eating much. Taylor didn't even come downstairs. I went to check on her after everyone else wandered outside. Her door was cracked open, the room dim despite the sunlight pouring through the windows. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. When I asked if she was okay, she didn't respond at first. Then, without looking up, she muttered something about the marks. "They weren't from an animal," she said finally. I wanted to argue, to reassure her, but the truth was, I'd been thinking the same thing. The day dragged on. We stuck close to the house, not really saying much, like we were all waiting for something to happen but didn't know what. The sense of unease had taken root, spreading through each of us in its own way. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we were all on edge. Sarah suggested a movie to distract ourselves, but the house's old TV barely worked, showing nothing but static. So, we sat in the living room, playing cards and pretending everything was fine. It wasn't until Adam suggested a midnight walk that things spiraled. At first, the idea seemed harmless enough. Maybe some fresh air would clear our heads. We grabbed flashlights and headed down the gravel driveway, staying in a tight group. The forest loomed around us, the trees taller and darker than they had seemed earlier. About 20 minutes in, Taylor stopped dead in her tracks. Her light was trained on the ground ahead, a set of tracks, deep and fresh, leading off the path. The prints were huge, too big to be human, but too defined to be from any animal we could name. Whatever had made them walked upright, the weight of each step sinking deep into the dirt. No one said a word. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. Then we heard it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to echo from all around us. It wasn't a growl exactly, but it was close. Taylor turned and bolted, and we followed without hesitation. The run back to the house felt endless, the shadows pressing in on all sides. Every snap of a twig or crunch of gravel sent my heart racing. When we finally burst through the front door, we locked it behind us and collapsed in the living room, gasping for air. No one asked what we'd heard or what we thought it was, but that night Sarah and Jake went missing. We didn't notice they were gone at first. After the chaotic dash back to the house, everyone scattered. I stayed in the living room, too shaken to move, while Taylor disappeared into her room. Adam went upstairs, muttering something about needing a shower. Sarah and Jake had slipped off together, and I assumed they'd gone to their room like they always did. But sometime after midnight, the air in the house changed. It wasn't a sound or a movement, just this oppressive weight, like the house itself was holding its breath. The quiet was suffocating. I paced the living room, the faint creaks of the old floorboards echoing in the stillness. When I couldn't take it anymore, I went upstairs to check on everyone. Taylor's door was closed, but I could see light spilling out from the crack beneath it. Adam's door was open, his room dark and empty. I knocked on Sarah and Jake's door, expecting to hear their usual muffled laughter or the sound of them talking in low voices. Nothing. "Hey!" I called softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "You guys good?" Still no answer. When I pushed the door open, the room was empty. The bed was unmade, the covers crumpled on the floor. The window was wide open, the curtain fluttering slightly in the breeze. I leaned out, shining my flashlight into the backyard. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the tree line, but there was no sign of them. No movement, no sound. The others heard me moving around and came to the door. Taylor stood there, pale and silent, while Adam pushed past us to look out the window himself. He cursed under his breath, but none of us had any answers. We searched the house first, though we knew it was pointless. Every room, every closet, even the basement. A dark, damp space with low ceilings and a dirt floor. But there was no sign of them. No footprints. No notes. Just that open window. When we finally stepped outside, the night seemed colder than it should have been. The woods were a black wall, the dense canopy swallowing our flashlight beams. "Stay close," I said, my voice shaking. We spread out, calling their names. The only response was the occasional crack of a branch beneath our feet and the faint rustle of leaves. As we moved further from the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. And then we found the first one. Near the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line, Jake's flashlight lay on the ground. Its beam pointed upward, catching the lower branches of a towering pine. The light flickered faintly, its battery almost dead. But there was no Jake, no Sarah. The ground around the flashlight was disturbed. The dirt scuffed as though there had been a struggle. And near the base of the tree, half buried in the loose earth, was something small and metallic. A charm bracelet. It was Sarah's. We didn't go any deeper into the woods. Not that night. We barely slept that night. Back in the house, the four of us sat in the living room, each lost in our own thoughts. Adam kept pacing, muttering that they'd probably wandered off and would be back by morning. But none of us believed it. Taylor stared at the charm bracelet, turning it over in her hands like she was trying to make sense of it. I couldn't stop replaying the scene at the edge of the woods. The flashlight, the disturbed ground, the absence of sound. It wasn't just that Sarah and Jake were gone. It was how cleanly they'd vanished. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. I shot upright, my heart pounding. Taylor was already standing, clutching the charm bracelet. Adam had frozen mid-pace, his eyes fixed on the door. The air was colder now, and the faintest breeze stirred through the room, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pine. No one moved at first. Then, slowly, I crept toward the door, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The door was open just a crack, swinging gently on its old hinges. Beyond it, the porch was empty. I stepped outside, scanning the yard. The moon hung low, casting a pale light over the overgrown grass and the dark silhouettes of the trees. Something moved at the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was one of them, Jake or Sarah. I could just make out a shape standing still, half hidden by the shadows. "Jake!" I called, my voice trembling. "Sarah!" The shape didn't move. I took a step closer, my flashlight flickering as I aimed it at the figure. But the beam didn't seem to reach them, like the darkness around the trees was swallowing the light. Behind me, I heard Taylor's voice, sharp and panicked. "Don't!" I froze, my hand tightening on the flashlight. When I turned to look at her, she was standing in the doorway, her face pale as a sheet. "There's no one there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced back toward the trees, but the figure was gone. We locked every door and window after that, barricading ourselves in the living room. None of us spoke about what we'd seen or hadn't seen. Morning came slowly, dragging the night's fear into a pale, gray dawn. But Sarah and Jake were still missing, and we all knew the woods held the answers we didn't want to face. The next morning, the silence in the house was unbearable. None of us wanted to talk, but we also couldn't sit there doing nothing. It was Adam who finally broke the stalemate, slamming his hands down on the kitchen counter. "We have to go look for them," he said. Taylor didn't argue, though her expression told me she didn't agree. I felt the same tug of dread pulling at me. But Adam was right, we couldn't just stay inside, waiting for them to come back. We packed quickly, each of us grabbing flashlights, water bottles, and anything that felt remotely useful. I shoved a heavy metal wrench from the toolbox under the sink into my backpack, the weight of it oddly comforting. The woods looked different in daylight, less menacing maybe, but not safer. The trees were tall and dense, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the sun. It was cool beneath them, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and moss. We retraced our steps from the night before, heading back to the spot where we'd found Jake's flashlight. It was still there, the beam long dead, lying exactly where we'd left it. The scuffed ground was more visible in the light. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been subtle. Dirt was kicked up in arcs, and broken twigs were scattered around like something or someone had been dragged. The tracks led deeper into the woods. Adam led the way, moving quickly, his determination masking his fear. Taylor and I stayed close behind, our flashlights cutting through the shadows even though the sun was still up. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our footsteps and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. After about an hour, we came to a clearing. The ground here was uneven, dotted with rocks and patches of moss. At the center stood another tree, massive and ancient, its bark scarred with the same deep grooves we'd seen before. Taylor froze, grabbing my arm. She pointed to something near the base of the tree. It was Sarah's jacket, crumpled and dirty, as if it had been dropped carelessly. Adam lunged for it, but as soon as he touched it, a sharp sound broke the silence. A crack, loud and sudden, like the snapping of a branch. We all turned, our flashlights darting wildly. The sound had come from the trees, somewhere to our left. "Who's there?" Adam shouted, his voice echoing. There was no reply. Then we heard it again, the low, guttural sound from the night before, a deep rumble that seemed to come from all directions at once. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. Taylor grabbed my hand, pulling me back toward the trail. Adam stood frozen, clutching Sarah's jacket. "Adam, let's go," I shouted. But he didn't move. His flashlight was fixed on something deeper in the woods, his face pale and slack. I didn't look, couldn't. I just grabbed his arm, yanked him with all my strength, and ran. We didn't stop running until the house came into view. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were on fire, but the sight of the porch gave me just enough strength to push forward. Behind me, Adam stumbled, still clutching Sarah's jacket, and Taylor was gasping for breath, her face streaked with tears. Once we were inside, we slammed the door shut and pushed the heavy sofa in front of it. The adrenaline buzzed in my ears, making it hard to think, but the one thing I knew was that we weren't safe, even here. Adam dropped the jacket on the coffee table and collapsed into a chair, staring blankly at the floor. Taylor was trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the sofa like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. What did you see?" I asked Adam, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He just shook his head, his mouth opening and closing as though he was trying to find the words but couldn't. Taylor spoke instead, her voice shaky and uneven. "It was watching us. I don't know how, but I felt it. Like it was right there, just beyond the trees." She looked at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "You didn't feel it?" I had. The weight of its presence, the way it pressed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I'd felt it all, even if I hadn't dared to look. Hours passed in silence. None of us wanted to leave the living room. Every creak of the old house set us on edge. Every shadow seemed to shift and move. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that whatever had been out there in the woods had followed us back. As night fell, the house seemed to come alive with sounds. The faint tapping returned, this time more insistent. It wasn't just at the windows anymore, it was at the walls, the ceiling, the doors. We huddled together, too afraid to move. Then, around midnight, the power went out. The sudden darkness was absolute, our flashlights barely enough to pierce it. Adam fumbled with his phone, its weak glow illuminating his pale, drawn face. "What do we do?" Taylor whispered, her voice shaking. No one had an answer. It was then that we heard it again, the guttural sound from the woods. Only this time it wasn't distant. It was right outside the house, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards. And then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling the house. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, crunching against the gravel outside. We sat frozen, too scared to breathe, listening as they circled the house. Every step seemed to echo louder than it should have, like whatever was out there wanted us to hear it. Taylor gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Adam clutched Sarah's jacket to his chest, his knuckles white. None of us moved. The sound stopped at the front door. The silence was worse than the footsteps. My ears strained for any hint of movement. My heart beat so loud I was sure it would give us away. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. 3 measured taps against the wood. We didn't move. Another knock followed, louder this time. Still slow, deliberate. Taylor started shaking her head, mouthing no, no, no over and over. Adam clenched his jaw, his eyes fixed on the door. When the third knock came, it wasn't soft. It rattled the frame, reverberating through the room. The thing outside didn't wait for an invitation. The door creaked, the sound dragging out as if the hinges themselves were reluctant. Our makeshift barricade barely held, the heavy sofa shifting an inch under the pressure. And then came the smell. It hit like a wave, pungent, metallic, and thick, filling the air with the scent of damp soil and rot. My stomach turned as I clamped a hand over my nose, fighting the urge to gag. Something pressed against the door. Not a knock this time, but a scraping like claws or nails dragging over the wood. Slow and deliberate, it made its way down the length of the door, pausing at the gap near the bottom. A shadow moved there. It wasn't human. Too large, too distorted. It flickered in the thin beam of Adam's flashlight, a writhing, shifting mass that defied shape. The scraping stopped. We held our breath, every second stretching into eternity. And then it moved away. The footsteps resumed, retreating this time, fading into the distance until the night swallowed them entirely. But none of us felt relief. The air was still heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself had absorbed the thing's presence. We didn't dare move until the first light of dawn began to seep through the windows. When we finally stepped outside, the world looked unchanged. The woods as still and quiet as they had been the day before. But the gravel driveway was marked with deep indentations, heavy and uneven, leading away from the house and vanishing into the trees. We knew, without saying it, that it wasn't over. We decided to leave that morning. None of us said it out loud, but the unspoken agreement was clear. Whatever had happened here, whatever was still happening, we couldn't stay. Adam threw a few things into his backpack, leaving the rest of his stuff scattered in the room. Taylor didn't even bother packing. She just grabbed her phone and the charm bracelet. The car was parked at the end of the driveway, and getting to it felt like crossing a battlefield. Every step through the overgrown yard felt exposed, like something was watching us from the tree line. I tried not to look at the woods, but I couldn't help it. My eyes kept darting to the shadows, searching for movement. The forest seemed closer than it had the day before, the trees leaning in, their twisted branches casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. When we reached the car, Adam yanked the driver's side door open and threw his bag onto the back seat. Taylor slid into the passenger side, while I climbed into the back. "Let's go," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Adam turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and went silent. "Don't do this," he muttered under his breath, twisting the key again. The engine whined, struggling to turn over, but it didn't start. "Try again," Taylor urged, her voice rising. He did over and over, but the car wouldn't budge. I felt the panic rising in my chest, every failed attempt making the air feel thicker, heavier. And then the woods went silent. The faint rustle of leaves, the chirp of distant crickets. Everything stopped. The oppressive quiet from the night before was back, pressing down on us like a weight. Taylor turned to look at me, her face pale. "It's here." Before I could respond, the car shuddered violently, tilting to one side. A loud crunching sound followed, metal groaning as if something massive had gripped the rear bumper. Adam swore, fumbling with the gear shift, but it was useless. The car was pinned. I looked out the back window, and my blood turned cold. Something was behind us, barely visible through the dust-streaked glass. It was enormous, its shape shifting, undefined, like a shadow struggling to take form. But its presence was undeniable, radiating malice that seemed to seep into the air. The car lurched again, tilting further. The sound of tearing metal filled the air, and I screamed, clinging to the seat as the vehicle shook. "Get out!" Adam yelled, throwing his door open. We didn't need to be told twice. Taylor and I scrambled out, stumbling into the gravel as Adam bolted toward the house. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The sound alone was enough. The guttural, unearthly growl that seemed to echo in my chest, rattling my bones. We reached the porch and threw ourselves inside, slamming the door behind us. Whatever was out there didn't follow, not immediately. But as we stood there, gasping for breath, we heard it again. The footsteps, circling the house. We huddled in the living room, paralyzed by the sound of those footsteps circling the house. They didn't rush or hesitate. They were steady, deliberate, like whoever or whatever was outside had all the time in the world. Adam gripped the fireplace poker in both hands, his knuckles white. Taylor sat on the floor, staring at the charm bracelet in her lap as if it might tell her what to do. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see something staring back. "Do we run?" Taylor whispered. Her voice was so quiet it was almost drowned out by the creak of footsteps on the porch. "And go where?" Adam snapped. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by raw panic. "The car's wrecked, and there's nothing but woods for miles." The footsteps stopped. We all froze, listening as the silence pressed in. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. Slowly, I leaned forward to peek through the gap in the curtains. The yard was empty. "There's nothing there," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. I didn't believe them even as I said them. Then came the tapping. It started at the window nearest us, light at first, almost gentle, but insistent. A soft tap-tap-tap like fingernails on glass. Taylor's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Don't look," she said, her voice trembling. Couldn't help it. My eyes were drawn to the sound, to the faint shadow that moved just beyond the glass. It wasn't human, too tall, its limbs too long and thin. Its fingers, or whatever they were, slid across the window pane, leaving smears of something dark and wet. "Get back," Adam hissed, pulling me away from the window. The tapping moved, traveling to the next window, then the next, circling the house just as the footsteps had. The pattern was maddening, methodical. It was toying with us. And then the tapping stopped. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Every creak of the house, every rustle of fabric seemed deafening in the absence of sound. Taylor was the first to notice. Her gaze snapped to the fireplace, her mouth opening in a silent scream. The chimney. A soft, shuffling sound came from inside it, growing louder by the second. It wasn't the steady scraping of a small animal or the rustling of falling debris. This was deliberate, something large forcing its way down. "Move!" Adam yelled, grabbing Taylor's arm and dragging her toward the kitchen. I followed, my legs shaking so badly I thought I'd collapse. We barely made it into the hallway when the sound exploded. A deafening crash of bricks and soot spilling onto the hearth. The thing in the chimney had made it through. I didn't dare look back. I could feel its presence, the weight of it pressing down on the house like a storm about to break. We scrambled into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind us. Adam jammed a chair under the doorknob, his hands shaking so badly it almost didn't hold. "What do we do?" I gasped, clutching the edge of the counter. My thoughts were a blur, panic clouding any chance of reason. Taylor's breathing was shallow, her face pale. She clutched the charm bracelet tightly, her knuckles white. "It's not going to stop," she whispered. "It's not going to let us leave." Before I could respond, the door rattled. Something was on the other side, testing the flimsy wood. The rattling turned into pounding, the door shuddering with each impact. The chair under the knob creaked, the legs inching backward with every hit. "We have to go," Adam said, his voice tight. "There's nowhere to go." I snapped. The door splintered. Without thinking, we bolted for the back door. Adam threw it open, and we stumbled into the yard, the damp grass slick beneath our feet. The woods loomed in front of us, dark and uninviting. But there was no choice. Whatever was inside the house was worse. We ran, branches slashing at our faces and arms, roots catching our feet. The shadows closed in around us, the faint light of the moon barely enough to guide the way. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit were relentless. Heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, low growls that seemed to reverberate in my chest. Taylor tripped, falling hard against a rock. I stopped, pulling her to her feet as Adam yelled for us to keep moving. Her hands were scraped, blood smeared across her palms, but she didn't complain. Somewhere ahead, Adam shouted, "There's a clearing, over here." We broke through the trees into an open space, the ground flat and bare, as if nothing had grown there for years. In the center was a structure, an old, crumbling stone well. "This way," Adam yelled, racing toward it. "Are you insane?" I shouted. "It's the only thing here." We reached the well as the sounds of pursuit grew louder, the thing crashing through the trees just behind us. The smell hit us again, sharp and rancid, and I nearly gagged. Adam grabbed a length of old rope tied to the side of the well and threw it down. "It's either this or that thing." One by one, we climbed down into the darkness. The walls were damp and slick, the air heavy with the stench of mildew. I went last, pulling the rope down with me as I descended, the sounds of the thing growing louder above. The bottom of the well was shallow, a narrow space that barely fit the three of us. Water pooled around our feet, cold and murky. Above, the sound stopped. We held our breath, the silence stretching impossibly thin. Then, slowly, a shadow moved across the opening of the well. It was looking for us. The shape lingered, blocking out the faint light of the moon, its distorted silhouette filling the space above. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. Taylor clutched the charm bracelet, her lips moving silently as if in prayer. Adam gripped the fireplace poker, though it was useless now. For a long moment, the shadow didn't move. Then, with a sound like a deep exhale, it vanished. We stayed in the well until dawn, too afraid to climb out. When we finally emerged, the woods were eerily still. The house was empty, the car still wrecked. Sarah and Jake were never found, and none of us ever spoke of what happened again.